get to the Pentagon and report it. And I will have to say this. I went to a fairly substantial Southern school, and I'll just name it Vanderbilt. Graduated from Vanderbilt a long time ago. And one of my very specific friends back then was a guy I'll just call Skip. And I learned very quickly when I realized Skip was very much interested in law enforcement and obeying the rules and making sure other people did as well, that his father was a CIA agent. And I remember one afternoon in the late fall having a beer with Skip. The subject of strange things came up, and he began telling me certain things, including something his father had told him as a CIA agent, and said, Skip, if the general public had any idea how much information our government has about unexplained aliens and UFOs and appearances of these odd phenomena with extraterrestrial intelligence and all of that stuff, it would cause an international panic. And he said, we have to keep such a lid on it that the everyday Joe, the non-thinking men, obviously like you and Peter, would absolutely recoil in horror, thinking that we're not the best and we're not the only ones out there. Thinking men can't rule out that possibility, and if we subordinate, the supremacy of that which brought us here to believe that we're the only things that it would ideate or create, then we are absolutely mocking fools of ourselves, in my book.
Yeah.
Well,
go ahead, James.
I was just going to say, I'm trying to follow some sort of a basic schedule here, so I'm trying to steer this back towards whatever other material we need to cover during this point, and I'm hoping that you and I can continue on, too, to comment on all of this.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Boy, that makes good sense to me, and we asked for 30 minutes from our very busy guest tonight. He's given us 50 minutes of his time, for which I'm infinitely grateful, and boy, what a great description of two cases, his sighting on the 8th of June and his sighting on Christmas back in 1969, and I want to thank our guest for consenting to come on tonight. Great job.
Well, guys, frankly, again, as I said 3 weeks ago, this would have been the farthest thing from my agenda, but the importance of it and the magnitude of getting the word out to discover the truth, because we do need to know. And again, James, I'm not following any byline of yours. I just happened to see that in your website when I pulled it up 2 minutes before this phone call, that I didn't script or anything like that. I believe people want to know, and God bless you guys, and I truly hope that you continue your search. And again, I'm honored to have had the opportunity to converse with two gentlemen like you, and it's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Tom. We've been honored as well by your presence here, and thanks for a great job, and thanks for coming on tonight.
All right, guys. Good night. Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you again.
Boy, that's a fascinating story on a fascinating subject of what these objects are that appear to be showing up now on a regular basis, James. I have no idea what they are, and I think it's correct to say that the members of our audience here tonight know just about as much about these orange or red or yellow fireballs as I know after having collected reports about them for 17 years now.
Exactly. I became aware of it 3 or 4 years ago, and I noticed, of course, that the sightings seemed to peak around 4th of July, which is a very frustrating time if you're a UFO investigator, as I believe you well know,
Yes,
because of the volume of calls you get, and a lot of them you have to screen out, so you're doing more screening than normal. But I kept getting reports about unusual orange lights that were above and beyond any reported fireworks activity. Everyone described them as strange. I would try to rule them out as planets or the International Space Station or anything else. and they just kept coming back. And then it all kind of culminated for me when a close friend of mine who's an airline pilot made a report of something that he saw in broad daylight over Houston Intercontinental Airport, and it was in a restricted area where airliners were busy landing and taking off, and he was waiting to take off, and he observed something that was a very bright reddish orange that had a hard outline, and it was dropping balls of red light that disappeared. And this was witnessed not only by him but his flight crew. This is an example of one of these many reports, and he was about to report it to the tower, and they practically grabbed the microphone and said, "Don't do it, don't make the report," because they were afraid that the result would be that the terminal would be shut down.
Yeah.
And everybody was scared and startled by this.
Yeah. Well, these reports are coming in all the time, and interesting observation, I think. And this is the culmination of the last 17 years of my life, during which, as you know, James, I have been a full-time investigator trying to bring the truth to the American people. That's why I'm so grateful to have an opportunity to appear with you tonight and to have had our superlative guest on. But it appears to me that even though we're getting a vast quantity of cases, my estimate is that we are receiving, all ufology is receiving probably not more than 1 out of 10,000 reports that could be submitted from people who are seeing UFOs. People are aghast by that estimate, but I think for whatever reason, and I know you and I have discussed this on several occasions, most people are predisposed to not submit a report of a sighting of something very unusual. In some cases, those unusual objects might have been UFOs. And what we have to do, among many other things, is try to convince the American public and people in other countries as well that if they see something, it is very helpful if they report it, and they report it in writing promptly. But trying to get people to do that is going to be a very difficult battle indeed.
Especially for people who have professions at risk.
Yeah.
Because they don't want, law enforcement, military, people like that, because they're actually putting their careers on the line whenever they make a report, regardless of how objective and factual it is.
Yeah. And isn't that an absurd statement on the country, the United States of America, that prides itself in having the First Amendment, the right to say anything you're darn well pleased within certain limits, and yet people engage in self-censorship all the time. It is a fascinating phenomenon, in my opinion, even more fascinating than the UFOs that appear to be visiting our planet.
The human reaction, I agree. That's the quality of the witnesses. What happens when you find a witness and what they're telling you is ringing true, and they begin to understand that you really are willing to listen to them. It's an amazing process that you go through.
Yeah. Many people I talk to have just witnessed a UFO for the first time in their lives. The interesting thing is you can, without any difficulty at all, hear the emotion in their voices, a twinge of incredulousness or incredulity. I don't know what the correct term there is, but it's a fascinating process to watch people awaken to the fact that reality may be dramatically different from what our mere five senses tell us reality seems to be. It's a very interesting phenomenon. That's one of the more interesting aspects of my job, taking UFO reports from wake up to lights out 7 days a week.
Well, one of the things that I was really hoping that we would talk about tonight, and I wasn't sure if we were going to get there with Tom or not, is how recent events or recent reports that you've heard fit back into an event that I'm still extremely interested in, which is the Phoenix Lights phenomena from March 13, 1997.
Yeah. The most, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many investigators, probably the most dramatic UFO event in the history of modern ufology, which of course started here for the most part up in the state of Washington on the 24th of June, 1947. The celebrated sighting by Ken Arnold was sort of the kickoff of modern ufology. But one of the sidelights of this event in South Carolina that Tom described to us, and I'd prefer not to get too detailed on this, but one of the sidelights is that it appears that my suspicion, something I've talked about on countless radio programs for 14 years now, about the report that U.S. military forces were placed on Defense Condition 3, DEFCON 3, as a result of the Phoenix Lights, appears to have merit. It appears to have been a correct report initially back in 1997, and if that's the case, it tells us that the government does indeed know about UFOs. After all, if they're going to Defense Condition 3, and for the benefit of our listeners tonight, and a point that you and I have talked about on several occasions, James, that was the very night that President William Jefferson Clinton was injured while staying at the home of Greg Norman, the Australian professional golfer, and the pieces are beginning to fall in place. The question I ask rhetorically is, was the President of the United States injured as an indirect or direct result of the U.S. Air Force intercepting UFOs over Phoenix back in March of 1997? That tells me that our government certainly knows about this phenomenon.
Well, that's a truly great question. And then, of course, one of the things that's fascinated me is that if you fast forward 10 years to 2007, you have former Republican governor of Arizona, Fife Symington, going on video on CNN and admitting that he actually saw the Phoenix Lights and that he was convinced that it was an extraterrestrial spacecraft. And that's with him having been a former captain in the Air Force and combat pilot in Vietnam. So I think that puts it all in perspective.
And there are only two people I can imagine who could call the governor of Arizona in March of 1997 and prevail upon him to not talk about what he had seen, not talk about it for 10 years, as is the case. I think through the fine work of Leslie Kean and her investigation, Governor Symington came forward. Only the President of the United States or the commander of Luke Air Force Base could have convinced the governor of Arizona to say nothing about what he had just seen.
That's an excellent point. Just to make sure that we get there, I wanted to ask you if there were any recent cases, aside from the one that we've already discussed, that have really gotten your attention, or anything that fits into a larger pattern.
Yeah. Well, the only pattern that I can see right now is these amber or orange or red lights that we've been talking about during this program. However, one of the things I have seen recently, and I'm very pleased by this, is that people who describe themselves, label themselves as either amateur or professional astronomers, light astronomers, are now submitting reports of events that they allegedly have been witness to. So apparently, the acceptability of submitting a UFO report, particularly among astronomers, professional or amateur, whatever the difference may be, the willingness for them to come forward is increasing, and that's a good sign in ufology, because obviously these people are not only skilled observers, but they're familiar with the night sky. They're able to distinguish Cygnet or Sirius or Deneb from something else, and I'm very pleased by this trend.
I think that's very important. And then, of course, I always make any opportunity I get. They probably are also able to distinguish the International Space Station when it makes its transit across the sky and rule it out, because that's another frustrating cause of false reports.
It is indeed. Our trusty webmaster just updated the National UFO Reporting Center website, ufocenter.com, just tonight, not an hour ago. And there, as you correctly point out, and you've struggled with that as a very experienced UFO investigator yourself, trying to cull out cases of mistaken identity from the real thing. But you're right, the International Space Station, we get reports about it every night from around the world. And we're trying to condition people when they see something pass overhead that looks like a very, very bright star, first check to see whether it might have been the International Space Station. It's a considerable source of frustration for ufologists.
Well, I think that one of the points, too, that equally, I guess, argues the other side is that I've always gone by that statistic I heard years ago, and I believe genuinely that it's true, that there is one high-quality UFO event somewhere in the world every hour of every single day. They just don't get reported on CNN. And by high-quality UFO event, I would define as one that has high strangeness combined with high witness credibility. In other words, something that cannot be conventionally explained because of its shape, its lighting, its manner of flight, or whatever. It defies conventional description.
Yep.
And witness credibility, of course, is a harder thing to judge.
Yep, that's for sure. And if you multiply that by my estimate that we in ufology are getting only one out of, at most, 10,000 reports or sightings of genuine UFOs, you begin to realize what the true nature of this phenomenon may be. I think we are being visited certainly weekly, and I agree with your assessment. It may be daily and hourly, and it tells you that this is a truly remarkable phenomenon that mankind is just beginning to awaken to, in my opinion.
Has there been a case that came to mind, if someone said, what's a case that made the hair stand up on the back of your neck?
Oh, yeah. Well, with regard to abduction cases, abductions, I believe, may be rare, but I'm satisfied that they occur. The peculiar death and mutilation of Mr. Todd Seas in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania, back in the year 2004, 2002, I think it was, August 4th, 2002, and people can read reports on our website. That is a very, very unsettling case to me. Going back still further, the object that was caught by a television news team on the morning of the 25th of August, 1995, reported to the National UFO Reporting Center by many, many people. I play videotape of it at all my presentations. Some of the best video I have really stands out, in my opinion. Very, very unusual case and dramatic. Caught, not only seen by many witnesses, but caught by a television news team. And the interesting thing is Channel 4 out of Windsor, Ontario, Canada, played it, so far as I know, only one time on television, and from that date forward, they have refused to share it with anybody else. It's very strange.
Well, I think that I have seen that footage, and it is extraordinary. I don't think it's quite so strange that it didn't get aired again, because one of the books that I consider a textbook in this field is Terry Hansen's book called The Missing Times, that describes in great detail the extent to which various alphabet soup agencies can exercise a very quick chokehold on key points of communication in our media system. If you let me decide which stories are going to be carried on the wire services or over the internet, I can control what people think about any subject, and most especially extraterrestrials and UFOs.
Absolutely. And that, I agree with you wholeheartedly. that there appears to be influence on the press with regard to how they handle these reports or whether they happen to carry the reports. Back the Phoenix Lights case again, as you well remember, James, it was 10 weeks before the profundity of that case was even alluded to in the national press. There was no national press coverage at the time of the incident.
And that's no small coincidence. I need to announce at this point that this is an epic broadcast on the Inception Radio Network. I'm James Clarkson, your host, and with me is Peter Davenport, Director for the National UFO Reporting Center. And at this point in the program, I'd like to go to the chat room for a question and answer session. So while Peter and I continue to discuss this worldwide ongoing phenomena of UFOs, you are invited to submit your questions in the chat room at this time. So anyway, that was one of those necessary announcements I needed to make in my attempt to stay on track tonight, which is no thanks to the limitations of my home setup, which I hope to improve in the future. I do want to thank the staff who has been very supportive of me and put up with my attempts to make everything work out okay. I'm assuming you're still there, Peter?
I'm still here. Are we still live, or are we off?
We are still live.
Yeah.
I'm hoping you and I can keep going unless you have some need to leave, and that we can. I am going to possibly toss out questions as we continue to discuss the phenomena.
Sure. I thought we were limited to a strict hour, but I'd be happy to stay for a few more minutes if we have some questions come in. I'd be happy to field questions.
Exactly. That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah. Yep. Well, you asked about unusual cases that come to mind quickly. And, of course, you've seen my PowerPoint presentation in which I address a number of the most dramatic cases that have been reported to the National UFO Reporting Center. One that comes to mind, and people who might be on the Internet during our program can go and take a look at the myriad of reports that the National UFO Reporting Center received as a result of this incident, occurred on the 14th of November, 1997. It was a Friday night. I remember it dramatically. I ended up being on an international radio program that night to talk about it. It was a cluster of very perfectly round objects that passed over the state of Washington. Actually, they were first seen from Oregon, headed to the northeast. Within minutes, they were passing over the Olympic National Park out in the western end of Washington state, and they were seen from as far north as Vancouver and Victoria, BC, and they then passed over the state of Idaho, northern Idaho, and they were last reported as they continued to the northeast over British Columbia and Alberta. The interesting thing about that, it took me many, many years, James, to collect enough information about that case to be able to address it intelligently. But in the final analysis, it turns out that that was, we believe, one of 4 similar clusters of objects that passed over the United States that night, and Mexico. So they covered Mexico, the central coast of California, Washington, and one more point that I'm not quite as sure of. So at least 3 groups of perfectly round objects in a V formation passed over the coast of the United States that night. Very, very interesting case. And again, if anybody wants to see the actual primary data that was submitted to our center, they can go to ufocenter.com, go to the data for November of 1997, and look at all the cases we have posted there.
That's really good. One of the things that I've always appreciated, one of the advantages that you have, of course, is that when you get multiple reports coming into one center, you can actually plot them out and attempt to establish a origin, direction, field of occurrence, those kinds of things that any one witness would be almost impossible to do.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the problems that we're experiencing in ufology. You know, we've built these computers, and we have the internet, and we have databases, and what is happening, whereas we should be bringing all of these cases into one or into a small number of facilities, so all of these cases can be looked at and compared to one another. Everybody and his brother is setting up a website that has a UFO sighting report form on it. So we're actually going in the wrong direction, in my opinion. But there's very little that one person can do about that. It's just not possible